So my senior year of high school, I knew without a shadow of a doubt what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. Now, you may not believe this, but it was not pastoring. It was broadcast journalism. I knew without a shadow of a doubt that that is what I wanted to do. And I got to my first year of undergrad, and I hated every moment of it. And there's a great story of God redeeming that, of God leading me to actually trust Him, rather than just lip service, actually saying, God, you have a plan, and I want to join with that. But I remember my very first day. I grew up in Clay Center, Kansas, and 43 miles down the road was Kansas State University. My brother had gone there, my sister had gone there. I was so certain that this is where I was supposed to go that I didn't even do a college visit. I had a buddy who had an apartment, and I said, okay, we're going to move in. And so the first part of August, I moved in. I didn't even bother to look at the map of where my first class was. So part of that was just 18-year-old silliness, but I remember waking up the first day of class and being utterly terrified. I was uncomfortable on that campus. I had grown up in a very small environment where there was less than 400 kids in my entire high school, and now I was stepping onto the campus of Kansas State University, which had 22,000 students. I felt very uncomfortable and very much afraid. And I remember calling my mom and saying, I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm not supposed to be here. This is a mistake. And she told me to be fine, and I found my first class. I wasn't even late. It was amazing. But I want you to think about a moment where you've been uncomfortable stepping into something new. Maybe it wasn't quite as terrifying as your first day of college. Maybe you had a better experience transitioning from high school into college. Maybe your utter crazy point was going from middle school to high school. Maybe you moved growing up, and so you started a new school. Maybe you started a new job, and maybe this has been recent. But there's probably a moment in your life where you can think about how you felt completely uncomfortable. You were stepping forward, leaving something behind, leaving comfort behind. The reality is that we love security. We love predictability. We love knowing what's next. We love comfort. Even those of you who think that you thrive on the spice of life, ultimately, let me tell you what I know about you. You like predictability. Maybe you like to mix it up and you don't order the same thing from the Culver's menu every single time, but the reality is you go to the sink and you expect that there will be clean water. You go to your car and you expect and you enjoy the predictability that your car will actually start when you want it to. We want to know things will turn out exactly how we want them to before we take that first step. But what if, as we're in this series about the big picture, what if the greatest thing that God wants to do in our life lies beyond the borders of our comfort zone? Think about Frozen. And Elsa, here's her line from Frozen 2. I've had my adventure. I don't need something new. I'm afraid of what I'm risking if I follow you. She had her family, she had her kingdom, she had her peace, but then she hears this voice calling her into the unknown. Maybe you're not a Frozen fan. Maybe you have to go a little bit more into the Shire. You're a Bilbo Baggins fan. Think about Bilbo Baggins and his story in The Hobbit. He's perfectly content in his cozy home in the Shire. But then Gandalf comes knocking, inviting him on an adventure. Bilbo's immediate response, nope, not me. Wrong guy. He's terrified of what lies beyond the front porch. And when he finally steps out, he finds a life bigger than anything he's imagined. Friends, maybe you're here today and God has been nudging you towards something uncomfortable. Maybe it's a calling, a hard conversation, a step of faith. And maybe like Elsa or Bilbo, you're resisting because it's uncertain and it's uncomfortable. I want to invite you to open with me this morning to Genesis. We've been working through in this series over the past couple of weeks, working from the garden to the cross, saying that Easter is coming, and we know that God just didn't suddenly say, hey, you know what, I think I'm going to send Jesus to earth. He's going to die on a cross. He's going to rise from the dead. No, this has been at work because sin devastated the landscape of our reality. Sin broke the relationship that we had with God. And so God has been in this story of redeeming and restoring that which was broken and that which was lost. And so these undercurrents of God working, pointing that Jesus would come, are not just things that by happenstance appear, but God was at work orchestrating that. We saw how in the garden sin destroyed that. We saw last week how evil had gotten so bad that God said, I'm going to save just a few. It'd be easier almost to wipe it out. But we saw how God also promised that he would not do that again. And the rainbow in the sky sets that for us. This morning we're going to close up at the end of Genesis chapter 11 and then kick into the first part of Genesis chapter 12. And I want to remind you as you're turning there to this very first book of the Old Testament, I want to remind you that Moses and the writers of the Pentateuch are doing so as a look back. This is how we got here. It's being written for the Israelite people saying, look, we're getting ready to walk into the promised land. We're wandering through the desert. Here's how we got into this situation. We got into the situation because sin has been prevalent in our story, but God is at work in our story. We're standing here ready to walk into the promised land. We've been wandering through the desert because of our sin, but evil was so bad that God said, I just feel like I could wipe everybody out. But he chose not to because God is gracious. And he preserved them. And the Israelites that are hearing this firsthand and the people that we get to look back into their story were preserved because God chose to lead them through Noah. And so we're going to pick up at the end of Genesis chapter 11 this morning and see the faithfulness of God in the midst of a messed up people, a people that ultimately God uses now to point us to Jesus. God uses Genesis, God uses the story of Exodus, God uses the story of his people in the past to remind us the work that God is doing in and through us now because of Jesus. We saw last week how God's heart was not for destruction, but for relationship. Relationship as he created and designed us for. The last part of Genesis chapter 11 picks up through Noah's line. Noah's righteousness before God, it wasn't his perfection, but he was obedient and willing to serve as God's provision. And so Genesis 11 walks through Noah's line, continuing on towards these people that are reading the words of Genesis as Noah and the writers of the Pentateuch are writing it. It goes through pretty rapid pace until you get to verse 27. And then suddenly we get more detail here. Genesis chapter 11, verse 27 says, this is the account of Terah's family line. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran became the father of Lot. While his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in the Ur of the Chaldeans, in the land of his birth. Abram and Nahor both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. And she was the daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Ishka. Now Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from the Ur of Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Terah lived 205 years, and he died in Haran. Now, while this passage primarily serves as a genealogical transition, it reveals an important truth about God's calling, about human hesitation, and about the faithfulness of God's covenant promises. The text tells us that Terah, Abram's father, set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. This is the equivalent to Ur of the Chaldeans is Iraq, and Canaan is the Israel area right now. They're not that far apart, except that you have a giant desert in the middle. And so rather than going straight across through the desert, you actually have to go north to what's modern-day Turkey and then coming down south. And so when they get to this modern-day Turkey area of Haran, they stop. They settle. Haran was not the intended destination. Terah's journey had a greater goal, but they settled there. Somewhere along the way, he stopped short. Now, I don't know if it was discomfort or comfort. I don't know if it was familiarity or whether it was just the hardships of the journey that led him to settle. But we do know that Terah never made it to Canaan. It wasn't that they chose a bad spot. They just didn't finish what God had set before them. See, friends, comfort in and of itself is not bad. Comfort in and of itself is not bad. But choosing comfort over obedience to the calling, or when we choose to honor the gods that we place before us, is both detrimental to our relationship with God and to the work that he wants to do in and through us. See, when Terah settled, when Abram settled, when Lot settled, when Sarai settled in Haran, they missed that God was faithful to his promises. Friends, faithfulness is part of the character of who God is, that he is the covenant keeper. This covenant that he said that he initiated with Abram, that he initiated with Adam, that he ratified with Noah. These covenants that God said, I will be faithful. See, friends, more than a destination, they shorted their opportunity to view and to know God's character. Friends, when we settle for comfort, when we settle for the ease, we miss God's character. Comfort in and of itself is not bad. It's not bad to enjoy comforts of life. However, when God calls us into something and we settle instead for comfort rather than being obedient to what He's called us to, the number one thing we miss out on is that relationship with God. We miss out on knowing God's character, the richness of His goodness and His faithfulness. So with that as the backdrop, we turn and we begin in Genesis chapter 12. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." It's easy to jump straight into Genesis chapter 12 and read the text as black and white. Well, sure, if God showed up and talked to me, of course I would do exactly what God told me to do. Friends, put yourself in Abram's shoes just for a little bit, or his sandals, or whatever he's wearing. He's 75 years old. He has a stable life in Haran. He had security. He had family. He knew the different cul-de-sacs. He knew the different cross streets. He knew that you could get quickly from here to there if you took this side street. He had familiarity with it. Now, lest we try to dismiss as, well, their 75 is our 40, friends, that's still 75 years of living. Abram is very comfortable where he is. Abram has seen the sun rise and set 27,000 times. He's eaten lunch 27,000 times. He's done a lot. He's seen a lot. He's been through a lot. He's likely settled in a lot of ways. He knows what it is to be comfortable. He's done his time. But then God shows up and does something incredible. God speaks up and says, "Go. Go, leave your home, leave your family, leave without knowing where exactly you're going or what the journey will be like. Hey, Abram, let's go." That's uncomfortable. That's uncertain. And yet, as verse 4 gives us Abram's response. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. Friends, this is an important reflection for us. Abram stepped out of what was familiar, left behind what was secure, and followed God's voice. Why? What made the difference between Abram and Terah's story? Was Abram better than his father Terah? No. But Abram recognized that God's calling comes with a promise. God's calling comes alongside and comes with a promise. I guarantee you that anytime God has called you to do something, that every command that God has given you as His child, as His people, He has guaranteed it with a promise. God has never called you to do something and said, "I'm just going to stand back here." Anytime God has called you to do something, whether it be a little bit uncomfortable or a lot of bit uncomfortable, anytime God has led you to it, He has promised to come with us. And it has come alongside a promise of who He is and what He's done. God does not call us to test us. God does not call us into something to trick us. He always promises to be with us, and He always promises to provide for us. Test me in that. This week, try and figure out if there's some time that God has called you to do something and then not showed up by His standard. Right? That's a little asterisk where God oftentimes doesn't show up in the same way that we think He should, because we would always like to be comfortable and follow Jesus. It doesn't work that way. When we follow comfort for comfort's sake, we miss out on the character of God. But we understand when God calls us into something, comfort is not His first and foremost priority. God says, "I've got a work to do in and through you, and I'm going to provide. I'm going to be there with you." Unlike his father, Abram didn't settle for comfort. He pursued God's promise. And because of that, Abram became the father of a nation through whom all the families of the earth would be blessed. Again, remember, Genesis is written as a look how we got here scenario. For us, we can read it and say, look how we got here. Because God chose to call Abram, because God said, I will bless you, you as one sitting here this morning, and anyone who was reading this in the first ancient reading of this with the Israelites would have said, we have been blessed by God because Abram said yes. Because anytime God called him, God also provided for them. Terah started a journey but settled in comfort. Abram, on the other hand, obeyed and kept moving even when it was uncomfortable. How many times does God call us into something greater but we hesitate because of the difficulty? Or when we reach a place that feels good enough? I imagine that's what Haran was for Terah. It's good enough. Let's just stop at 400 miles and not go the last 200. We're almost there. Friends, we can live our whole lives in comfort and completely miss the calling of God. Rachel, Tyler, Eric, Katie have said yes to following Jesus in the context of, I'm following Jesus because he's called me to love him and to live in a relationship with him, not because it's comfortable. Anyone who says, I follow Jesus, also has to recognize that that may not mean, likely does not mean, living a life of comfort. We can live our whole lives and completely miss the calling of God. It's possible to settle in a place that feels comfortable, but is not the place that God has truly called us to. God says go, and Abram goes. Now, in black and white, it looks like there's no hesitation. There's no debate. There's just obedience. Now, for the sake of reality and for the sake of the black and white text, I'm sure there was a lot more involved. I think we can do a disservice by thinking of Abram as this one-dimensional character that was just waiting off stage for 75 years for God to use him. And the moment God said, hey, you're on, Abram threw all his belongings into the back of his truck and went to Beverly Hills. Right? This is what we think. We're like, okay, I'm reading Genesis 12, and okay, God gave this promise, and sure, I'm in on this. I imagine that this is not how it went. And we can do this because we don't give that same permission to ourselves. We know how deeply we wrestle with where to eat lunch after church, let alone the important and far-extending implications of uprooting our lives or walking into the uncomfortable things that God has called us to. Friends, you and I are not one-dimensional. Abram was not one-dimensional. Can you imagine, spouses, if your husband or your wife came home one day and said, hey, I was thinking we should move. I don't have a forwarding address just yet, and I don't know what the journey will look like, and don't even ask me for a timeline, but let's go. Now, there might be some days where you want to leave the dumpster fire in the rearview mirror and leave responsibility behind. Abram had so much going for him. He had a life lined up to make him comfortable. Life was good. And so I'm sure there was a lot of, did I hear God correctly? Was this just last night's pizza talking? How is God going to take care of my retirement account if he's asking me to live like that? What will people think? What if I'm wrong? What if this doesn't work out? What if? What if? What if? I'm sure the list for Abram was long. It was not just, okay, let's go. And that's why for so many of us, the unknowns become overwhelming and they paralyze us. It's easiest and it's most convenient for us just to shrug it off and say, I'll stay in the Shire where it's comfortable. Gratefully, that's not Abram's story. Let's continue in verse 5. Abram took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Again, it's not one-dimensional. Verse 6, Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Morah at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. Friends, even though Abram had not yet seen the fulfillment of this promise, he trusted that God was faithful. He didn't demand a full plan. He didn't ask for proof. He obeyed because he believed that God is the one who keeps his word. He believed that God is the one who keeps his word. Friends, that's what faith is. Faith is obedience based on the promises of God. Faith says, I don't fully know how this is going to work out, but I know the one who called me to it is always faithful, is always good. I know the character of God, who he is, and when he calls me to it, I can therefore be obedient. I don't see the destination, but I know that there will be a destination. That's what faith is. Faith is obedience, is taking that step, not based on it being a firm spot already, but being on the fact that God is the one who led him, and it's based on the promises that God would remain faithful. Abram's story doesn't end with uncertainty. It ends with blessing. Verse 8 says, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. The rest of Genesis 12 walks through, as Abram walks through the land. And this is incredibly impactful when you realize that this is a how did we get here scenario. The Israelites wandering in the desert would have known the places where Abram was visiting. This Canaan that they did not step into, that caused them to wander for 40 years in the desert before taking that rightful place, is the same Canaan that Abram was walking through. And so when they say Abram was here and he worshiped God, they're confronted with the reality that they chose not to worship God in those same places. And when they conquer those lands in the coming years, as they leave the desert, as they step out in faith, in obedience, trusting that God is true to his promises, and they conquer these places, they can go back and be, Abram was here. Abram worshiped God. This is not a new place. This is God redeeming and God continuing the work that he is doing. Genesis continues to walk through Abram's and Sarai's story. Part of that is that Sarai is unable to conceive, but yet Abram is promised to be the father of a great nation. And so it's through Abram that Ishmael is born, and it's through Abram that Isaac is born. And it's through Isaac and that line that these Israelites are raised up because God is faithful. There's even a moment where God leads Abram to sacrifice his son, but right before he does it, God provides a different sacrifice, a full sacrifice. Because he's saying, Abram, are you stuck more in this promise, or are you really trusting me? Are you stuck in the promise, or are you walking in a relationship with me? Friends, that points us to Jesus. Are we stuck in the promise, or are we holding into that relationship? Because Jesus, he endured suffering. Jesus endured rejection. Jesus endured the agony of the cross because he knew the greater purpose of what was to come. And because of Jesus' obedience, we are now part of God's covenant promise. Through Jesus, we are children of Abraham. Through Jesus, we receive the blessing that God promised. Through Jesus, we have hope beyond this life. Because comfort in and of itself is not bad, but comfort is temporary, isn't it? And so is discomfort. And I say this because there are some of you in this room who are not asking about comfort, but you're asking about discomfort. You hear this and you say, that's great for Abram, that's great for Jesus, but what about my life? What about the things I face right now? Because for some of you, this message is about leaving comfort isn't the challenge. For some of you, this challenge about leaving comfort isn't the real challenge. For some of you, discomfort isn't a choice, but it's your daily reality. Maybe you live with chronic pain. Maybe you carry deep grief or heartache. Maybe your life hasn't turned out the way that you expected. And so the question for you isn't about, how do I stay in this comfort spot? Your question is, how do I shake off this discomfort when it feels so plaguing? And if that's you, I want you to hear that Jesus understands. I don't mean that in trite words, but Jesus knew what it meant to suffer. Jesus knew what it meant to feel the weight of pain, of grief, and of agony. So when we talk this morning about living for comfort, we realize that life is temporary, and God's leading in our life, his calling is always good, even when we can't see it, and he is always faithful. I'm not minimizing your pain. I'm not minimizing your agony. I'm not minimizing your grief. But the pain that you feel now is temporary. The hardship that you endure right now is temporary. The suffering of this world is temporary. But the hope that we have in Jesus, the future he has promised for us, friends, that is forever. Just like Abram had to leave the comfort behind for something greater, you and I cling to a greater promise. That a day is coming when every tear will be wiped away, when every sickness will be healed, when every sorrow will be turned to joy. And so we wrestle with that now. On both ends of the spectrum, saying, I don't want discomfort to disqualify me from following the calling of God, and I don't want my comfort to disqualify me from following the calling of God, because that is the peace that is eternal. Friends, we can spend our whole lives being comfortable and miss what God is calling us to do. And the reality is that obedience isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. And that's so exactly what we see in Abram's story. God does his greatest work not in our comfort, but oftentimes in our discomfort and our obedience. Ultimately, the greatest example of this obedience is Jesus himself, leaving the comfort of heaven to step into the unknown of human suffering for our sake, for your sake. He obeyed the Father's call even when he knew it would lead him to the cross. And because of his obedience, friends, you and I have life. So my question this morning is, what is God calling you to step into? What might you be resisting because it's uncomfortable? What are you angry about God because it has been so uncomfortable? Maybe what God's leading you to do is to forgive someone. Maybe it's to trust him with a difficult season. Friends, we can spend our whole life chasing comfort, or we can step into obedience to the God who promises to always be faithful.